Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, March 23rd, and since I never teach medieval history anymore, but next year, hopefully, I will. The current schedule has me teaching one class. I've decided to wear the arming cap and crusade to recover the kingdoms lost. Maybe not that, since we have to stay home. But we were going to talk about a very specific point today in period two of the AP US History curriculum. And that point is, if you're one of my students, you'll notice on the bottom of the first page, it's number 5, and it says, explain how patterns of exchange, markets, and private enterprise developed and how government responded to these issues. Well, private enterprise, of course, was different for each government that came to the Americas. Where France showed up, they were a little late in the game, and they did not establish colonies. And although there were 12-ish thousand displaced after the French and Indian War from Canada, we don't actually see them establishing colonies for mercantilist purposes. It's more like smash and grab capitalism. They hunt, they mine, they cut down, and they send back to France, not to create finished goods for the markets created in the New World, but instead for simply local use and distribution. Spain, on the other hand, developed the encomienda system, in which the Spanish lords of the New World saw the local people divided among themselves in a system of geographic labor. And they were allowed to use that labor any way they wanted as long as they converted them to Christianity. The encomienda system, of course, saw a Pueblo revolt against them, and it was 80 years until Spain was able to restore the southwest of America, what is today Southwest America, back into the encomienda system. And it was somewhat modified after that. We see that for Spain, they intermingled among the population. That did not happen to a large degree with the French. That did not happen to a large degree with the English. But the Spanish became permanent residents of the Americas with their colonial model. Spain was a classic capitalist, of course. They took as much gold as they could, and they brought it home, and they bought what they thought they needed with it. They bought raw materials from other places. I told you the story about the cannons. They bought cannons from England, and 100 years later, Spain had 100-year-old cannons, and England had gold in a cannon factory. So England had a little bit better model where they practiced mercantilism in the New World. As you know, mercantilism is the belief that a positive balance of trade makes a nation strong. If you have not said that out loud today, it would be helpful if you shouted it at one of your siblings or parents. I think that's going to make a better home environment, ultimately. I know it makes a better classroom environment. That mercantilism was developed by having colonists from England go into the New World, whether they be landowners, lords, common laborers, artisans, or indentured servants. As you know, slavery was introduced in 1619 by the Dutch, and there are basically 3 regions of the Americas that develop in different ways. In the South, it became slavery agriculture, focused somewhat on rice, indigo, tobacco before the introduction of cotton. And in the middle colonies, we see much tobacco production, a lot of trade, resource harvesting. And in the north, we see more manufacturing, shipbuilding. There's a lot of things that come from trade from the Indians and some specific agricultural products. So the North was perhaps more diverse because of the development of the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism, which we talked about last time. So in England's model, of course, they colonize the New World by putting their own people in the Americas. Those people harvest, grow, they get raw materials, which are then sent back to England and turned into finished goods. Those finished goods are sold both domestically in England and to all the markets that the British have around the world. That was the secret to British mercantilism. They were able to get raw materials from a variety of places and then sell those finished goods made from them back into a variety of markets. And we will see during America's imperialist phase that that's what we do as well as we cross the Pacific. And then, of course, we taught the Japanese how to do it, and they created Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere from that information. So when the English develop this system of mercantilism in the New World, it runs for about 80 years on what is known as salutary neglect. The colonists are largely on their own. The Roanoke colony failed. The Jamestown colony was only saved because of the introduction of tobacco. And slowly, gradually, this population and the variety of materials gained from those populations increased over time. Until finally, somewhere, let's see, I have it ready. So, the Dominion of New England is going to be established somewhere around 1686, and that will mark the end of salutary neglect in the New World. Salutary neglect, of course, is where England was a little bit busy with their own problems, both politically and militarily, and they didn't have a whole lot of time to govern the colonies. Eventually, in 1689, the British, 1686, the British show up and say, basically, colloquially, Daddy's home. And while it's a bit cute that you guys thought you could govern yourselves and play judge and create court systems and elect mayors and establish a militia, the real government, however, the British say, is the British government. And so the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, New Hampshire, Maine, and what is today Rhode Island are all shoved together in a giant super colony governed directly by the British. It becomes directly a royal colony. And the British aren't interested really in being gentle about it. In fact, those who are initially given power in the Dominion of New England go around asking all the Puritan churches if the Church of England can meet in their halls, in their churches, in their spaces. And of course, the Puritans have no interest in allowing the King's Church back in their self-created spaces. In fact, one of the major problems during this time is the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening is a movement, the first spontaneous movement in the colonies, and this first spontaneous movement is over the issue of enthusiasm. The Puritan colonists want to have an emotional response to their religion. They want to be able to express themselves through potentially the public conversion experience within their church services. In fact, there are movements within this that allow speaking, clapping, praying, and even dancing in a variety of congregations in New England. And the Church of England is normally a very controlled experience. The pastor of a Church of England church is, of course, the mouthpiece of the king himself. And the message comes from the king to the pastor or priest and then to the congregation. And through salutary neglect, the Puritans had, of course, said, we're going to step away from the king because he doesn't want us to have that kind of emotional experience, the enthusiasm, the expression of enthusiasm. And instead, they decided to govern themselves religiously. Also, one of the things that changed within the Dominion of New England is property rights, property laws. Property in the colonies was seen as a way to ensure independence. If you had your own property, you could grow your own food, you could be your own person and make your own decisions. And when England came back and ended salutary neglect, one of the first things they tried to do was modify colonial land laws to be more in line with English land laws, where land was given by the king rather than simply claimed by an individual in the colonies. And while the colonial method did, of course, create tension with the Indians and lead ultimately to the Pequot War and a variety of other conflicts, the British insisted that the colonies turn themselves basically into a model of England, literally a New England. And the colonists weren't so good at, as you know, we are today, we're not so good at conformity or following rules. One of the things about us that we grew into during that salutary neglect period is self-government, in making decisions on our own, in having a say in our government, largely because of the antinomianism of Anne Hutchinson. If we could have that vertical relationship with God, why can't we have the horizontal relationship with the government? And we wanted a say in what was going on. And of course, the British had no interest in that once salutary neglect ended. So the question today, the topic, is number 5 on page 1. Explain how patterns of exchange, markets, and private enterprise developed. And largely they developed agriculturally, from building trades, the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism, and how governments responded to these issues. Well, the British government responded basically by taking away individual choice. We know that France and Spain developed different systems than England did, and ultimately the Dominion of New England was one of the reasons why the colonists decided that the king had gone too far. And this was not necessarily a trigger for separation, but it created questions about how much independence can the colonists have, because there are 3,000 miles between the colonies and the king, and at some point that lack of responsiveness requires a personal decision-making model, rather than waiting 6 months for a message to come back on how to proceed. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and tune in tomorrow. Stay safe, and don't touch anything, anyone, ever, at all.